All right, today we're going to be talking about the Second New Deal, which was Franklin Roosevelt's second effort at trying to deal with the Great Depression. Now, by the time the Second New Deal rolls around, toward the end of his first term as president, he had a few new problems to deal with. Number one, mainly being the Dust Bowl. What happens between 1933 and 1935 is in the area known as the Great Plains, which would be states like Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, that general area, they had some unusually dry years where they barely had any rain. On top of that, the farmers had been overfarming the fields. And when you overfarm fields, the soil becomes all dried out, it loses its moisture, and it loses its nutrients. On top of that, if you ever go to that area of the United States, it's very windy because it's very flat and there's very few trees, or at least there are very few trees back when the Dust Bowl hit between 1933 and 1935. Well, all these dust clouds sweep in, and you'll be able to see that from the pictures I'm going to show you. And between 1934 and 1939, we see 350,000 farm families leave the area. Now, that's families. You gotta imagine that each family probably has at least 4 or 5 people in it, between a husband, a wife, and a couple of children. So millions of people leave the area. And this is supposed to be the farming heartland of the United States. So if we look at some of these pictures, you can see the dust sweeping in. And it would be very difficult to breathe. The wind would become very heavy because it had all of this debris in it, and it could break windows. If it got into car engines, it would ruin the engines. It would ruin a lot of stuff, and it would just make a big mess and make it hard to breathe. Some of these pictures are pretty eerie. So the government eventually had to step in and do something. And since one of the big problems was over farming the land, the government decided to return that land to grazing. Plant grass there. Grass will hold down that dirt. And then start raising livestock. Start raising cattle, start raising pigs, whatever. Raise animals and give that soil a chance to regain its moisture again and nutrients so it doesn't all dry out and blow up all over the place. So the government actually gave this material to the farmers in that area, the ones who stuck around. The long-term plan was to plant millions of trees. You can see some trees here that were planted around that era, and that was 70, 80 years ago. Now they're extremely tall. The trees will create a windscreen that cuts down on the wind. And trees also maintain moisture in the area. Some other laws that were passed during the Second New Deal that we consider to be pretty noteworthy. You had the Works Progress Administration. Well, I already talked about the Civilian Conservation Corps. That was the one where if you were a young man, you could get welfare if you lost your job. But here's how it worked. You went down to the government welfare office, they gave you a shovel, and they said, go work 40 hours this week. You're going to build some roads or work on a dam or build a school or something like that. You're going to do manual labor, and then we'll give you your welfare check. Well, the Works Progress Administration was the same idea. You'd have to work for your welfare check. The government created jobs for you, except it was for more white-collar type of workers rather than blue-collar workers. So you had your writers, your teachers, librarians, actors, musicians, and artists. The National Youth Administration tried to stop the problem of students dropping out. Unfortunately, families just couldn't afford to get by, so the kids had to drop out of high school and go and work. Sometimes kids are dropping out a lot younger than that. They were dropping out 7th, 8th grade. And they had to go work and try to support the family because oftentimes the parents were out of jobs. So what happened is the government gave a bunch of money to schools. And they said, create work-study programs. So that would be like a student sitting in the library after school. They were able to study. And at the same time, excuse me, they're getting paid to sign people into the library, to put books back, to file forms. So they're making money while they're studying. They don't have to drop out of school to get a job. Here's a picture of a mural that was done. This was one of these government jobs that was created. The government told an artist, we want you to paint a mural, put it in a building, or something that we can hang on a wall in a government building, we'll give you money for it. Here's a picture of a work-study program. You have a young man, he's a college student, he's teaching a self-defense class. So this is after his regular class hours. He's making a little money while he's at college, so he doesn't have to drop out and work full-time. And we move on to probably the biggest impact that is still around from the Great Depression and the New Deal, the Social Security Act. And everybody has one of these cards today, as long as you're a citizen of the United States. So one of the biggest problems during the Great Depression was the disabled people and elderly couldn't get jobs. The only people who were working were young, healthy, fit men. There was a lot of manual labor, manufacturing type jobs back then. So if you were older, you didn't have a shot at getting hired because you wouldn't be what would be called productive enough. So the government said we have to do something to help these people. A lot of people weren't saving for retirement back then. You were 65 years old and you had no money to your name. You had nothing in a savings account. So they started to make a Social Security tax. So when you worked, money was automatically taken out. You didn't have a choice. And then when you hit 65 years old, you'd be able to start collecting monthly payments. So this would help what we would call unemployable men and women, people who just, for whatever reason, couldn't get jobs, mainly in that elderly class, or people who had disabilities that prevented them from working. So if we look at this next slide, today the system's changed a little. The full retirement age now is 66. So this shows some scenarios of someone who would be eligible for $1,000 a month at 66 years old. Now, you can retire at the normal age and get your $1,000 a month. Or you could actually retire early, but you're only going to get $750 a month for the rest of your life. They'll do small cost of living adjustments on that, but for the most part, you're getting $750 a month. And that's not really going to go up too much. Or if you want to wait until you're 70, you get $1,320 a month under this scenario. So the longer you wait to collect, the more you get per month. So there's an incentive that the government gives to wait longer to collect your money. But if you really need it at 62, the option's there. Well, how did we get the money to fund some of these programs, to plant trees, to pay teachers and artists with all these new jobs, some extra money for Social Security if needed? Well, we had to tax people. So there were huge increases on the wealthy. The income tax got up somewhere around 60 or 70% for the top bracket during this second New Deal era. Big businesses that were making money, they taxed the heck out of them. And then they started to do inheritance taxes. Because what about the rich people who didn't work? The ones who were just rich because their parents had left everything to them. The money ran in the family. Well, they started to make a tax where if your parents died, your grandparents, aunt, uncle, whoever, and you were left some kind of estate, a house, a bunch of money, you'd have to pay the government a huge tax on that before you could take it. So you'd have to pay a fee to inherit. And that's how they got money to fund all these programs. That's just the Biltmore. That's the biggest privately owned mansion in the United States. I can't imagine what the inheritance tax would have been on this if it was inherited back in the 1930s. Because inheritance taxes were up, I want to say, around 60%. And finally, we have our National Labor Relations Act, otherwise known as the Wagner Act. This was just meant to help people in unions. Unions are meant to protect workers, to protect your rights, to make sure you don't have to work more hours than you're supposed to, make sure you're getting paid what you're supposed to. And the key thing here is it made sure that workers could arbitrate their grievances. So what this means is if a worker is having a problem with his administrators or his managers or bosses, whoever, and there's accusations being set on both sides, or they're both fighting for something different, and they can't come to some kind of agreement. Arbitration is when you bring in people from the outside. They don't know either party in this. They don't know the worker. They don't know the boss or the administrator or the manager. They sit down, they listen to both sides, and they decide a decision that's fair. They decide who gets what or who wins in the argument. It's almost like having a jury trial to iron out some kind of problem you're having at work. Probably even more important here is the Fair Labor Standards Act, which finally got rid of child labor for good. We learned about the Keating-Owen Act earlier on during Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, or actually it might have been Woodrow Wilson. It was during the Progressive era, Woodrow Wilson's presidency. And that had put a limit on child labor, but this is going to totally abolish child labor. It places a ceiling on hours and a floor under wages. What does that mean? Well, a floor under wages is just a fancy way of saying we created a minimum wage. So before this, the United States, there was no standard. You could pay people a penny an hour, or whatever, a penny a day, penny an hour, 2 cents an hour, you name it. Finally, the national government said from now on you have to pay people at least this much money. And throughout the years, and I just went back to 1955, used to be 75 cents an hour, and the national minimum wage has climbed all the way up to $7.25 an hour. Now states can set their own minimum wage as long as they don't go below the national minimum wage. So in Connecticut, I want to say it's somewhere around 8 something or $9 an hour for the minimum wage. And that's it for this presentation on the Second New Deal.